August 1944. Southern Italy baked under the late summer sun, the earth cracked and dry, carrying the faint tang of gunpowder and distant artillery. Barbed wire stretched in rigid lines across the dusty landscape, casting sharp shadows over canvas tents that sagged under the weight of heat and despair. Inside, a group of women sat huddled together on the coarse wooden benches of the Allied-controlled prisoner of war camp, their bodies gaunt, faces hollowed by weeks, no months, of near starvation. Their eyes, once bright with youth, were dulled by hunger and exhaustion. A faint clatter echoed across the camp as a tray of food appeared, carried by a camp orderly. The aroma was alien, almost unbelievable: bread, meat, and something resembling cheese. For these women, each morsel was a small miracle. Fingers trembled as they reached toward the tray, hesitant, as if touching it might shatter the fragile illusion. Some whispered among themselves, disbelief coloring their voices. Years of deprivation had taught caution, yet the instinct to survive was stronger. Outside, the world was still at war. Allied forces were pushing northward through Italy, forcing German troops into retreat. The war that raged beyond the fences had carved its way into the lives of these prisoners. Yet inside the camp, time slowed to the rhythm of hunger, roll calls, and the uncertain promise of sustenance. Each bite these women took was not merely nourishment. It was the first tangible sign of life, returning to bodies and spirits that had been stretched to their limits. The scene was quiet, almost reverent, broken only by the occasional sob or sigh of relief. In that moment, the stark contrast between deprivation and the simple act of feeding unveiled a powerful human truth: survival and the wonder of hope often arrive in the smallest gestures. It was a scene that would be remembered not for the war outside, but for the quiet resilience of those within. Late summer of 1944 had brought the war to a critical juncture in southern Italy. The Allies, having landed on the beaches of Salerno and later Anzio, were pressing northward against the German Wehrmacht, who clung stubbornly to the rugged terrain and fortified towns. The Italian peninsula, scarred by years of occupation and retreat, had become a patchwork of frontlines, supply routes, and displaced populations. Among the displaced were German women, wives, nurses, administrative staff, and sometimes young auxiliaries, captured during the slow, grinding retreat of German forces from southern territories. Unlike their male counterparts, these women were often considered non-combatants, yet the Allies treated them as prisoners of war under the Geneva Conventions, held in camps where resources were strained and conditions harsh. The camps themselves were makeshift, often occupying abandoned barracks or hastily erected tent cities. Canvas walls sagged under the weight of Mediterranean heat, while wooden pallets served as beds for the exhausted prisoners. Hygiene was minimal, water shortages were common, and disease was a constant threat. Rations were meager, designed to sustain but never to indulge, and for women accustomed to the rigors of wartime Germany, each day became a slow calculus of survival. Malnutrition left limbs frail, hair thinning, and skin drawn taut over bones. The psychological toll mirrored the physical hopelessness, anxiety, and suspicion gnawed at them as fiercely as hunger itself. The Allied officers overseeing these camps faced their own challenges. Logistics were complex, supplies were limited, and the need to maintain security was paramount. Every decision had to balance military necessity with humanitarian responsibility. Food deliveries, though routine, were often irregular due to the demands of advancing armies and disrupted supply lines. Medical staff worked tirelessly, sometimes improvising treatments with what little they had, watching as women faded before their eyes and celebrating cautiously when small recoveries occurred. Reports from these camps, preserved in Allied archives, document both the discipline imposed and the empathy extended, a delicate tightrope in a landscape defined by conflict. Outside the wire, the war in Italy raged with grim persistence. German troops, ordered to hold positions against overwhelming odds, frequently evacuated towns just ahead of advancing Allied forces. Cities like Naples and Salerno had been liberated months earlier, yet the movement of soldiers left civilians and auxiliary personnel, including women, vulnerable to capture. Each POW's transport reflected the larger chaos of the campaign, a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and logistical improvisation. For the women now seated in the camp, every day was a reminder of the world beyond, a world still defined by battles, retreats, and relentless uncertainty. Hunger shaped every thought and gesture. Meals, when they arrived, were as much psychological as physical sustenance. A single slice of bread or a thin portion of stew could trigger reactions ranging from cautious disbelief to tears of relief. Memory and trauma interwove with the present. Some recalled better days at home, some the chaos of evacuation. All felt the acute vulnerability of being entirely dependent on the mercy of captors and circumstance. Yet even in this hardship, small acts of care, an extra portion, a kind word from a nurse, shimmered like rare jewels in the monotony of deprivation. The second section of context deepens the understanding of the environment and the legal and humanitarian frameworks that shaped the lives of these women. By late 1944, international law had already set clear expectations for the treatment of prisoners of war. The 1929 Geneva Convention, though imperfectly enforced in many theaters of the conflict, required that POWs receive sufficient food, medical care, and protection from violence. For women captured in Italy, this legal framework became both shield and benchmark. Allied officers were acutely aware that their treatment of prisoners would be scrutinized both by history and by propaganda, and thus efforts were made to adhere as closely as possible to these standards. Even under the strain of war, in practice, compliance varied. Some camps struggled to deliver adequate nutrition due to supply chain interruptions. Others faced outbreaks of disease exacerbated by overcrowding and poor sanitation. The women themselves quickly learned to read the subtle signs of impending aid, the arrival of food trucks, the presence of medical staff, the shift in guard routines. The logistics of feeding the prisoners were a challenge unto themselves. Allied supply convoys were stretched thin across multiple fronts, from the advancing lines in northern Italy to the still tense operations in southern France and the Balkans. Rations had to be carefully calculated. Calories, proteins, and essential vitamins were distributed sparingly, yet attempts were made to provide at least one hot meal a day. Records indicate that cooks and quartermasters often went beyond protocol, improvising with local ingredients or salvaged supplies to create meals that were both nourishing and morale-boosting. For prisoners who had endured weeks without proper food, even a simple slice of bread or a small portion of meat became a profound symbol of hope. Psychologically, the anticipation of food exerted a powerful influence. Hunger shapes behavior in ways both predictable and subtle. Women in the camp exhibited heightened alertness, a mix of suspicion and eagerness whenever supplies arrived. Some whispered anxiously among themselves, uncertain whether the food was a ruse, a test, or a genuine provision. Others hesitated, holding back until reassured by the behavior of comrades or the gestures of Allied staff. These moments of doubt, fleeting as they were, underscore the depth of deprivation endured, and the complexity of restoring trust in an environment shaped by fear and powerlessness. Health outcomes were closely linked to the arrival of aid. Medical officers recorded visible improvements in skin tone, alertness, and energy following even modest meals. Digestive systems, long weakened by insufficiency, responded cautiously. The initial feedings had to be carefully portioned to prevent illness. Despite these precautions, the relief brought by proper nourishment was tangible. The tremor in hands subsided, expressions brightened, and for some, the first smiles in weeks appeared. In those small but significant moments, the human spirit revealed its resilience. The camp environment, shaped by scarcity and wartime logistics, was also a space where small acts of humanity carried enormous weight. Allied guards who offered reassurance, medics who lingered to check on the weak, or cooks who provided extra rations contributed to an atmosphere that, while constrained by necessity, reflected a commitment to humane treatment. For the women, each gesture reinforced a fragile bridge of trust, connecting their survival not only to physical nourishment, but to recognition of their dignity in the midst of war. As the women experienced the first tangible relief from their hunger, the scene was set for a deeper exploration of the multiple perspectives surrounding their plight: human, tactical, moral, and leadership-driven, that together illuminate the full complexity of life in these camps. The first angle to consider is the human experience, the raw, intimate reality of starvation and survival. These women, stripped of familiar comforts and thrust into the rigid routines of captivity, faced an ordeal that tested both body and spirit. Days blurred together, punctuated by roll calls, inspections, and the sparse distribution of rations. Hunger was not merely a physical sensation, it penetrated thought and memory, reshaping priorities and emotions. Each woman navigated a delicate balance between conserving energy and seeking nourishment, between hope and suspicion. Eyewitness accounts describe moments of near ecstasy when food arrived, fingers trembling over a slice of bread, eyes widening in disbelief at the sight of meat or soup, lips moving in silent prayers of thanks. It was in these small acts, touching, smelling, tasting, that the enormity of deprivation collided with the miracle of provision. Emotion ran deep and complex. Some women wept openly, their bodies succumbing to relief and long, suppressed despair. Others displayed stoic hesitation, unsure if the bounty was genuine or a trap, conditioned by months of scarcity and uncertainty. The interplay of trust and vulnerability shaped social dynamics within the camp. Small groups huddled together, sharing morsels discreetly. Friendships were forged in whispered negotiations over rationed bread. Rivalries occasionally flared as desperation overcame restraint. The human angle is therefore not merely a chronicle of hunger, but a study in resilience, adaptation, and the enduring capacity for emotional response, even under extreme deprivation. Turning to leadership and command, the perspective shifts to the Allied officers responsible for camp operations. Decisions about food distribution were rarely simple. Officers had to manage logistics, maintain security, and enforce discipline, all while adhering to international law and moral imperatives. Camp reports indicate that some officers went beyond mere compliance, insisting on balanced meals and humane treatment, even when supplies were strained. Their choices influenced not only the immediate welfare of prisoners, but also the morale of camp personnel and the broader perception of Allied conduct. Leadership here was an exercise in both practicality and ethics, organizing food deliveries, coordinating medical aid, and maintaining order without stripping prisoners of dignity. These calculated decisions directly shaped the experiences that the women would later recall with vivid clarity. The tactical or operational angle illuminates how these women came to be in the camps in the first place. The chaotic retreat of German forces from southern Italy left non-combatants vulnerable, often separated from male units and swept up in the advancing Allied operations. PO transport required careful coordination, as displaced civilians needed to be secured without hindering military progress. The location of the camp itself, a former military barracks or temporary encampment, was selected for both strategic oversight and ease of supply. Understanding these logistical choices reveals that the suffering of the prisoners, while profound, was embedded in a larger operational framework dictated by the movement of armies and the unpredictable ebb and flow of battle. From a technological or logistical perspective, the focus shifts to the means by which aid was delivered. Food transport was a complex endeavor, involving trucks, rail, and sometimes hand-carried supplies across difficult terrain. Rations were measured with precision, balancing caloric needs against limited availability. Records from Allied quartermasters show meticulous planning. Dried goods, canned meat, and fortified bread were allocated carefully, often supplemented by local ingredients sourced from surrounding areas. This logistical orchestration was crucial to prevent starvation and maintain order within the camp, illustrating the intersection of military efficiency and humanitarian concern. Each of these angles, human leadership, tactical, technological, interweaves to create a fuller understanding of the scene in the POW camp. They illuminate not only the suffering and resilience of the women, but also the deliberate, often constrained efforts by those overseeing their welfare. In these intersecting perspectives, the stage is set for the moment when all preparations and tensions converge, the climactic arrival of food, a turning point that transforms both body and spirit. The second section of angles expands into the perspectives of the German military and the moral dimension of the events within the POW camp. From the German viewpoint, the capture and internment of women was a source of anxiety and, in some cases, shame. These women were often family members of soldiers or auxiliary personnel who had little influence over military decisions, but bore the consequences of Germany's faltering position in Italy. Reports from German units note that the retreat through southern Italy was chaotic, with supply lines collapsing and communications severed. Families and comrades left behind were acutely aware that those captured might endure harsh conditions, feeding concerns that extended beyond the battlefield. Letters from the front occasionally mentioned captured female auxiliaries, expressing hope for their humane treatment while fearing the unknown realities of Allied camps. For the German command, the existence of such prisoners posed both logistical and reputational challenges, reflecting the broader disarray of the war effort in Italy. The moral and ethical perspective offers another layer of understanding. The Allied forces were operating under a dual mandate: to maintain military discipline and security while adhering to international humanitarian standards. Feeding the prisoners, particularly after extended periods of deprivation, was more than a matter of sustenance. It was a tangible assertion of moral responsibility. Field reports and personal accounts reveal that some Allied personnel viewed these acts of care as a moral duty, a necessary reminder that even in war, humanity must endure. The contrast between scarcity and provision highlighted the ethical weight of each decision, Every portion of food delivered, every medical check performed, became an affirmation of dignity in the midst of conflict. This moral framework not only influenced immediate outcomes, but also shaped historical narratives, forming a lens through which the conduct of war could be judged in retrospect. The human consequences of these ethical and logistical decisions were profound. As the women received nourishment, subtle shifts occurred, camaraderie strengthened, trust in the camp administration grew, and the psychological burden of captivity lightened, however temporarily. The act of feeding them was both practical and symbolic, bridging the gap between survival and hope. Anthropological studies of similar post-starvation feeding reveal that trust and psychological recovery often begin with such small gestures, illustrating how strategic and ethical decisions converge to shape human experience. Finally, these angles, military, moral, and human, interact with the tangible realities of logistics and leadership previously discussed. Together, they frame the narrative for the climactic moment when the women, long starved and uncertain, encounter food before their eyes. This convergence of suffering, preparation, and ethical intent sets the stage for a powerful turning point, where tension meets relief, and the broader context of war collides with the intimate drama of survival. It was early morning, the sun barely rising over the dusty camp in southern Italy. A thin haze of heat shimmered above the canvas tents, mingling with the lingering scent of dust and exhaustion. The women sat quietly, some huddled in groups, others alone, their eyes fixed on the barbed wire fence, beyond which the world of war continued to rage. The clatter of footsteps on gravel drew their attention. Allied cooks and orderlies were approaching with trays of food. For weeks, for months, the prisoners had gone without adequate sustenance, each day a measured struggle between hope and despair. As the first tray was set down, a hush fell over the group. The food was simple bread, a thin slice of meat, and a small portion of vegetables, but to the women it was almost unimaginable. Fingers reached out, hesitant at first, hovering over the rations, as if the act of taking might shatter some fragile illusion. Eyes widened, disbelief mingling with cautious hope. One young woman, her cheekbones sharp from malnutrition, whispered to her neighbor, questioning if the food was real. Another simply stared, tears welling in her sunken eyes, the first visible sign of emotion in days. The camp guards watched quietly, aware of the historical weight of the moment. Years of conflict had brought them to this strange intersection of war and humanity, where the simple act of feeding could redefine the atmosphere of the entire camp. Medical officers moved among the women, observing reactions and ensuring that bodies weakened by starvation could tolerate the sudden influx of nutrition. Every bite was taken slowly, almost reverently, each chew a reconciliation of body and mind with the long, denied needs of survival. In that moment, the world outside, the advancing Allies, retreating German forces, distant artillery fire, faded into the background. Here, within the confines of the camp, time seemed suspended, dominated by the elemental act of nourishment. Expressions shifted subtly. Disbelief softened into tentative acceptance, exhaustion gave way to a fragile vitality, and for a fleeting moment, the prisoners were not defined by captivity, but by the universal experience of relief. Yet the turning point was not merely about the physical feeding. It was the culmination of months of preparation, ethical decision-making, and logistical planning. The presence of food, the careful monitoring of its distribution, and the watchful but unobtrusive oversight of Allied personnel transformed the act into a human drama. A collective exhale of tension swept through the camp, a quiet acknowledgement that survival was still possible, that hope could take root, even in the harshest of circumstances. As the morning light strengthened, the scene within the camp grew more vivid. Women moved cautiously toward the trays, some still trembling. Others already hunched over in anticipation. The physical act of eating became an intricate negotiation between hunger and frailty. Bodies weakened by weeks of deprivation could not take in large quantities at once. Medical personnel guided the feeding, offering water and small portions, carefully observing reactions to prevent nausea or worse complications. Even this measured approach could not contain the emotional intensity. Murmurs of disbelief mingled with whispered encouragements, and a few women broke down entirely, tears streaming freely as they experienced the first taste of real nourishment in months. The atmosphere was electric yet subdued, as if the camp collectively recognized the gravity of what was unfolding. Officers and cooks moved methodically, but there was an unspoken acknowledgement that this moment transcended duty. It was a small, profound act of restoration. Some prisoners glanced at one another, sharing tentative smiles, a rare gesture of connection amid the isolation imposed by hunger and fear. The act of sharing food, something once ordinary, had become extraordinary. It was an affirmation that life could endure even within the confines of captivity. Throughout the camp, subtle changes emerged. The emaciated posture of many women shifted slightly, shoulders straightening as if physically buoyed by hope. Eyes that had dulled under prolonged stress began to glimmer, reflecting cautious curiosity and renewed alertness. This transformation was not instantaneous. Months of deprivation could not be undone in a single meal, but the psychological impact was unmistakable. The act of feeding functioned as a pivot point, a tangible marker of care and humanity that reshaped the daily rhythm of camp life. From a historical perspective, this moment illustrates the interplay between logistics, leadership, and ethical responsibility. Every tray, every portion measured and monitored, represented the culmination of careful planning under wartime conditions. The feeding was more than sustenance. It was an embodiment of international law, humanitarian intent, and moral courage in a context defined by scarcity and conflict. Allied officers were aware that their treatment of these women would stand as a testament to conduct in war, a subtle but enduring counterpoint to the violence consuming the world beyond the camp fences. As the day progressed, the initial feeding gave way to subsequent distributions, each reinforcing the delicate equilibrium between survival and well-being. Stories began to circulate among the prisoners, of kindnesses from guards, of extra rations, of medical attentiveness, that quietly reshaped perceptions of captivity. The women, once defined solely by their hunger and exhaustion, began to reclaim a measure of agency, responding to care with gratitude, curiosity, and the tentative stirrings of trust. This pivotal day would echo in memory long after the war ended, emblematic of the ways small acts of humanity could pierce the shadow of conflict. The feeding of these women marked not just a physical turning point, but a moral and psychological one, setting the stage for understanding the aftermath, the consequences, both immediate and enduring, of sustaining life amid the machinery of war. In the days following the initial feeding, the effects on the women became increasingly apparent. Bodies weakened by prolonged starvation began to respond, slowly at first, then with more visible vitality. Skin tone improved, energy returned in small increments, and tremors that had plagued hands and limbs diminished. Medical officers kept detailed records, noting weight gains and improved vital signs. Each improvement was a small victory, a tangible marker that the human body, when given even modest sustenance, could recover from extreme deprivation. These physiological changes also catalyzed subtle psychological shifts. Anxiety and suspicion, once pervasive, began to ebb as the women realized that the food was not a fleeting gesture or a trap, but a consistent part of camp routine. The morale of the camp transformed in tandem with physical health. Prisoners began to interact more, sharing stories and observing one another's recovery. Quiet laughter, once absent, emerged in small, fragile bursts. The communal act of eating together became a thread of normalcy in an otherwise disorienting environment. For Allied personnel, witnessing these changes reinforced the value of careful, humane treatment. Officers reported that well-fed prisoners were more cooperative, calmer during roll calls, and less prone to conflict, illustrating the intersection of ethics and effective camp management. Beyond the immediate camp environment, the feeding had broader ramifications. Allied records indicate that these humane practices were highlighted in correspondence and reports, serving both as documentation of adherence to international law and as a counter-narrative to enemy propaganda. The treatment of female POWs became a subtle but potent demonstration of Allied commitment to ethical conduct. Even amid the larger chaos of the Italian campaign, these reports, preserved in archives, provide invaluable insight into how relatively small acts of care could influence perceptions and morale, both inside and outside the camps. Health and nutrition improvements also had long-term consequences. Prisoners who initially struggled with severe malnutrition were able to regain enough strength to participate in basic camp activities and, eventually, to prepare for repatriation. These early days of recovery were critical, forming the foundation for more sustained rehabilitation once the war drew closer to its conclusion. Memoirs and interviews from surviving prisoners underscore the profound emotional significance of these meals. Many recalled the first taste of bread or meat, not just as nourishment, but as a tangible sign that life could continue beyond deprivation. In this way, the aftermath of the feeding transcended the simple act of providing calories. It reinforced trust, established a rhythm of care, and offered a glimpse of dignity amidst the relentless machinery of war. These consequences rippled through the camp, shaping both the daily lives of the prisoners and the broader historical record, demonstrating that even in conflict, acts of humanity can leave an enduring imprint on memory, health, and morale. As the weeks passed, the impact of proper nourishment became even more pronounced. The initial signs of recovery blossomed into measurable improvements in both health and behavior. Women who had previously struggled to rise from their bunks could now walk steadily to the mess area. Hens that had trembled uncontrollably began to stabilize, allowing for basic tasks and personal care. Medical logs detail the gradual restoration of weight, the strengthening of weakened muscles, and the reduction of infections that had taken advantage of malnourished immune systems. These physiological recoveries were mirrored by a growing sense of emotional stability. Where despair and suspicion had dominated, cautious optimism began to take root. The psychological and social dynamics within the camp shifted alongside these physical improvements. Groups of prisoners began forming informal support networks, sharing small acts of care or encouraging one another to eat and hydrate. Quiet conversations replaced the tense silence that had previously pervaded the tents. Smiles, once rare, became more frequent, tentative but genuine. For many, the act of eating together provided a shared ritual, a reminder of life beyond confinement, and a rare opportunity to reclaim personal agency even in captivity. These moments, seemingly small, carried profound significance in restoring a sense of humanity to lives previously defined by deprivation. On an operational level, Allied officers observed that these improvements had tangible benefits for camp management. Well-nourished prisoners were calmer, more cooperative during roll calls, and less likely to resist directives, reducing the risk of conflict and simplifying daily administration. Officers' reports from the period note the dual impact of these feeding programs. They fulfilled moral and legal obligations while also enhancing security and operational efficiency. This convergence of ethical responsibility and practical benefit underscores how humanitarian efforts can serve broader strategic objectives, even in the midst of war. The broader historical context also highlights the significance of these events. The humane treatment of POWs, particularly women, stood in stark contrast to the often brutal conditions in other theaters of the war. Archival documents, letters, and post-war testimonies emphasize that these acts of care were remembered by the prisoners as defining experiences, shaping their perceptions of the Allies and leaving an enduring impression that extended beyond the confines of the camp. For historians, these accounts provide crucial evidence of how deliberate, compassionate action can alter the lived experience of war and reinforce ethical conduct under extreme conditions. Ultimately, the aftermath of the feeding program was both immediate and enduring. Lives were saved, health was restored, and morale was renewed. The experience of receiving nourishment, once unimaginable, became a profound marker of resilience, trust, and humanity. These consequences, physical, psychological, and historical, set the stage for reflection, allowing us to consider not only what happened in the camp, but what these moments reveal about the enduring capacity for care and ethical responsibility even amidst the devastation of war. The sight of the women eating, their eyes wide with disbelief, remains a quiet testament to the resilience of the human spirit. In a world defined by violence and scarcity, the simple act of nourishment became profound, a bridge between suffering and survival, despair and hope. For those who had been starved, each bite was more than sustenance. It was recognition of their humanity, a reaffirmation that even amidst war, life could endure and dignity could be preserved. History often measures conflict in battles won or lost, territories gained or destroyed. Yet in moments like this, the significance is measured differently. In restored health, in trust rebuilt, in the fragile flowering of hope. The feeding of these women highlights the moral weight of wartime decisions, showing that acts of care and ethical responsibility can ripple far beyond their immediate impact. Allied officers, medical personnel, and cooks, through careful planning and simple humanity, altered the course of these prisoners' lives in ways that no battle could. For the prisoners, the experience left an indelible mark. Survivors recalled not only the physical relief of eating, but also the emotional and psychological affirmation that someone, even in the midst of war, acknowledged their worth. These memories became part of their narrative of survival, enduring long after the fences were dismantled and the war moved on. The story of starving German women given food reminds us that in war, small gestures often carry enormous weight. Nourishment, care, and recognition of human dignity can transform despair into resilience, shaping history in subtle but lasting ways. Even in the shadow of conflict, moments of compassion endure, offering a quiet but powerful testament to the enduring capacity for empathy and the profound impact of human kindness. The memory of that day, the trembling hands, the tearful eyes, the first taste of sustenance, serves as both historical record and moral reflection, a reminder that amidst destruction, humanity can persist in the simplest, most vital acts.